Hello everybody, and welcome back to the second part of the lecture, and where we're going to focus on punishment procedures. So just a reminder that punishment indicates that the future frequency of the behavior will decrease. And typically this is either in the form of positive punishment, where a stimulus is added to the environment and therefore makes the future frequency of the behavior decrease, or negative punishment, where after the behavior, a stimulus is removed from the environment and the future frequency of the behavior decreases. So when looking at negative punishment, where a stimulus is removed, this is typically contingent upon a response, and that removal of the stimulus decreases the future probability of that response. So recall that the future decrease in the response is the critical feature in defining punishment. So let's take a look at this example. Consider a child is participating in a classroom activity where attention from peers, a positive reinforcer, is available. The adult says, "Let's open our books to page 12. Each of you should read the first paragraph to your buddy." The child pokes his buddy, and then the adult places the child in timeout, therefore removing the peer attention. If the behavior of poking a buddy occurs less often in the future, then we can say that negative punishment has occurred. So two types of negative punishment interventions we are going to discuss are timeout and response cost. So timeout is the withdrawal of the opportunity to earn positive reinforcement, or the loss of access to reinforcers for a specified period of time. It is typically contingent upon the occurrence of target behavior, and if the effect of this is to decrease the future probability of the behavior, then this procedure has functioned as a punisher for the behavior. So there are different examples of timeout procedures. The first, non-exclusionary timeout, means the child is not removed from the setting. And the second, exclusionary timeout, means the child is removed from the setting. So within the category of non-exclusionary timeout, there are 4 different things that we typically refer to. The first is planned ignoring. In this situation, you typically remove the social interactions. The second, withdrawal of specific positive reinforcer, could be something like pausing the television after a behavior. The third, contingent observation, may involve placing a child in an area of the room where they can see what is happening but are removed from accessing what is happening. And the fourth one, a timeout ribbon, is often in the form of a colored band that is placed on the child's wrist and therefore signifies the availability of the reinforcement. When the ribbon is on the child's wrist, they are eligible to earn reinforcers. However, if the child engages in interfering behavior, the ribbon is removed and all forms of social interaction or access to positive reinforcers are terminated. The second type, the exclusionary timeout, is where an individual is removed from the environment. So the first, the timeout room, typically is the most controlled in preventing access to reinforcement. The partition timeout may be like setting up a partition within a classroom. And this, of course, has less control than the timeout room. And the third, the hallway timeout, which seems to be the most popular in schools, is the worst type of exclusionary timeout because typically those individuals are still accessing reinforcers, such as other individuals paying attention to them when they walk down the hall, escape from aversive situations, or access to preferred items. So although it's not typically recommended, there are some effective uses of timeout. Number 1 is to teach the alternative behavior and reinforce and enrich what we call the time-in environment. Utilize differential reinforcement to reinforce alternative and incompatible behaviors. In the event you do have to use timeout, you want to clearly define the behaviors leading to timeout. So all parties, including the target individual, should have explicit, observable definitions of the problem behavior. We also want to define the procedures for the duration of timeout. The initial duration should be short. Typically, kind of a loose and fast rule is that timeouts longer than 15 minutes tend to be ineffective. And lastly, we want to define the exit criteria. If the individual is misbehaving when timeout ends, it should be continued until the inappropriate behavior ceases. So what I typically do, if I do have to use timeout for my children, is I tell them I won't start the timeout timer until they have calmed down and the challenging behavior has ceased. So timeout is effectively implemented if it's applied consistently, if you are able to implement timeout in a calm and effective manner, and also evaluate the effectiveness. Remember, timeout is only an effective punishment procedure if the target behavior decreases. So you want to track the frequency and duration of timeouts and the collateral behaviors for side effects. Timeout should also be your last type of intervention considered. Punishment procedures, ethically by BCBAs, we need to consider antecedent and skill building, differential reinforcement, and other types of interventions before using punishment procedures. So I want you to take a couple of minutes to kind of think about how you normally see timeout implemented. And what are some potential issues considering the effective use of timeout? So go ahead and pause the slideshow at this moment, the video, and jot down some thoughts on these two questions. Okay, welcome back. We are going to have a discussion during our next class regarding these two questions. So please bring your responses to these questions to class. So some things I want to just reinforce is that we need to reinforce and enrich the time and environment. Clearly define the behaviors leading to timeout. Define procedures for the duration of timeout and the exit criteria. Apply this consistently. Evaluate effectiveness. And consider all other options prior to using, including legal and ethical issues. So the second type of punishment procedure is a response cost. This typically is a loss of a specific amount of reinforcement. It is contingent upon a target behavior, and it reduces the future probability of the target behavior. That's how we know it's a punishment procedure. So one example might be reclaiming awards or stickers, or like fines or a fine jar for where you have a loss of tokens or money. So if you guys can think about back to your house, if you ever had one of those swearing jars where you had to put money in, if you said a swear word, this would be an example of a response cost intervention. And it's only an effective punishment intervention if the behavior decreases in the future. So there's some different kinds of response cost procedures. There's the direct fine, losing 5 minutes of recess time for every behavior. There's bonus response costs, so where you wouldn't lose recess time, but you might remove bonus recess time, and that's really important. The difference between these two, because there are some legal implications of using response costs in a school system. We definitely want to combine it with positive reinforcement, and in particular differential reinforcement and differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors wherein available. You also can have a group arrangement where, contingent upon any member of a group, the entire group loses a specific amount of reinforcement. Now I want to bring up a incredibly important point about the group arrangement. If you suspect that one or two children in the classroom will consistently be the cause of the entire group losing that reinforcement, I would caution you to not use a group arrangement. Group arrangements can lead to individuals being targeted or bullied because of the response cost of the entire group. So again, effective use of response costs, specifically defining the target behaviors, as well as the fines. Establish rules for refusal to comply with the response cost procedures and explain these. You might use differential fines such that greater fines should be associated with more severe forms of problem behavior. Fines should be posed immediately. And if you do choose to use this, I would caution you to use something called a reinforcement reserve. So what we typically see with a response cost measure is that a child goes into the red. They don't have enough reinforcement built up to where they can sustain the impacts of a response cost. So if they constantly are getting points taken away from them and they are never earning points, a response cost system is not going to be effective. There's some very real issues with punishment procedures with timeout and response costs. Number one, increased aggression may occur, and we see this very consistently with punishment procedures. So when you're doing a response cost and removing a token, you want to ignore those outbursts. And then you might consider, well, maybe if there's a huge outburst that is going to happen, I might not use response costs. Or you have to be prepared to ride out the storm or that increase in behavior. We might have individuals become conditioned as aversive stimuli, and children might avoid those people who administer the response cost or the setting in which the response cost occurs. So you want to be sure to include positive reinforcement for appropriate behavior, either in that setting or with that person, to reduce the likelihood of this outcome. And unfortunately, response costs may also unintentionally suppress other desired behaviors, as well as the target problem behavior. And so if children are constantly losing points, they may just stop responding altogether. And finally, one of the biggest issues with response costs is it calls attention to inappropriate behaviors. And we spend a lot of time focused on those inappropriate behaviors. I would highly caution you to not over-recommend this, especially in a school environment, because it tends to be the intervention that people flock to. It is human nature to use punishment procedures. And unfortunately, when punishment doesn't work, humans tend to double down and make the punishment more extreme. And what we can see there is that could lead to individuals going into the red, not receiving any access to reinforcement, having increased aggression, or just stop responding altogether. So some guidelines for using punishment. We want to select effective and appropriate punishers. We want to use the least intensity of punishment as effective, deliver it immediately, unemotionally, punish each instance of behavior, provide prompts and reinforcement for those alternative behaviors, watch for those side effects, and record, graph, and evaluate the data daily. So punishment as a part of a behavior change plan has nothing to do with retribution. Punishment is not about threats. When punishers are threatened and not delivered, the child learns that your verbal threats are not associated with any actual punishing behavior. When you're considering using the least intensity of punishment that is effective, ethical guidelines and the doctrine of the least restricted alternative demand that is most effective but least intrusive is the form of punishment to be used after reinforcement procedures. So you want to ask these questions when deciding on the form of punishment. Will this punishment suppress other behavior? Will this punishment be controlled from application to application? Is there going to be high levels of treatment integrity? Or is one individual likely to implement a higher intensity behavior or intensity of punishment than another individual? Unfortunately, you have to remember that punishment is most effective when the stimulus is delivered at the optimal level initially. than when its intensity is gradually increased over time. So if the punishment gets harder and harder because the individual is not responding to it, what is going to happen is that individual is going to get conditioned to the punishment procedure and you will not see a reduction in behavior. You also want to deliver the punishment immediately. So every instance of the inappropriate behavior should be punished. And the punishment affects most of the behavior that immediately precedes the onset of the punishment. So if you want to punish a behavior that happened in the morning, talking about it and punishing it at night is not an effective means of punishment. You also have to deliver punishment in a very business-like, matter-of-fact manner. You want to resist statements such as, "I told you so," "now you've gone and done it, what do you have to say for yourself?" And with this frame of mind that all you want to do is modify behavior. We are not here to make people atone for their sins. And this is probably the biggest issue I see with punishment procedures is they tend to be reactive, they tend to be not well thought out, and the individuals tend to be really emotional in the application of the punishment procedure. Punishment is also most effective when the punisher follows each instance of the behavior, so an FR1 schedule for punishment. Otherwise, we tend to get individuals who have an intermittent reinforcement schedule, which of course strengthens a behavior. When using punishment, we want to provide alternative responses, prompt those responses, and reinforce those responses. The more reinforcement the learner obtains by admitting appropriate behavior, the less motivated he will be to admit the problem behavior. And of course, we have to watch for those side effects. The suppression of inappropriate behavior may increase expression of another behavior or complete suppression of all behaviors, meaning that the individual might give up and just stop trying. Decreasing episodes of self-injurious behavior may produce increased level of verbal noncompliance. They may just stop responding. And so you want to make sure your observations include collateral or parallel behaviors to ensure that the punishment procedure is not having unnecessary side effects. And finally, if you're not taking data, you're not doing ABA. You must record, graph, and evaluate data as frequently as possible and preferably daily. So data collection the first session or two of a punishment-based intervention is especially critical. Graphing the frequency of target behavior before, during, and after the presentation of the punisher can help you to establish whether or not that stimulus is actually functioning as a punishing stimulus, and therefore reducing the problem behavior. So overall, I just want to bring back the conversation to the right to safe and humane treatment for all individuals. The first ethical canon and responsibility for any human service programs is to first do no harm. And so you must consider reinforcement-based interventions first. Failure to use a punishing, on the flip side, failing to use a punishment procedure that research has shown to suppress the self-destructive behaviors, it could also be unethical because it withholds a potentially effective treatment and may maintain a dangerous or uncomfortable state for the person. So recognize that punishment is natural and it's a necessary role in learning. We should not shy away from punishment, as punishing positive and negative punishment contingencies occur naturally as part of everyday life. But we must first consider reinforcement-based procedures and teaching procedures so that individuals can get access to what they are requesting in a more humane way.